a waitress, arrogant millionaire, and a grand piano. What started off as a mean attempt to thoroughly belittle her ended up being one of those moments when the room held its breath as egos were crushed. You won't believe what she does next, using no more than her talent to turn it around. Make sure to subscribe. It was a warm Friday evening, and the hum of conversations filled the air at La Fontaine's, an upscale restaurant tucked into the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. Glass clinking, soft footsteps of servers, and the faint strains of jazz from a corner piano created an ambiance of refined indulgence. Deborah moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and smiles at least for those who caught her eye. This 25-year-old waitress went about her work with a quiet disposition and a sure spark in her eye, though in her heart she walked with dreams bigger than the sumptuous dining room around her. Her real passion wasn't serving tables, it was music. The piano had been her sanctuary since she was a little girl, where she could express every joy, every sorrow, every unspoken word. But dreams don't pay the bills. The need to work long hours at La Fontaine was a stepping stone to the music academy she so longed for. Few knew about her talent, and only the restaurant staff knew that on many occasions she stole moments at the old upright piano in the back room during her break. The door, in fact, opened that night as the evening rush was beginning to settle. In came Leonard Grayson. An instantly recognizable wealthy entrepreneur, he swanked into the room like it was his own private domain. Flanked by a few equally polished companions, Leonard carried himself with an air of superiority reputation, preceding him for a sharp tongue and a penchant for spectacle. Even staff who had seen it all stood a little straighter when he walked in. Deborah's co-workers exchanged knowing looks. Leonard wasn't an easy guest, the kind who likes to push people's buttons. For Deborah, he was just another table to juggle on an already long night. But tonight was going to be different. Leonard scanned the room, his eyes locking onto Deborah. There was something that caught his attention. A pause, then a smirk. The weight of his glare reached Deborah, but she merely shrugged it off, moving to refill water glasses and clear plates. But Leonard wasn't quite through with her. He had already made up his mind that she was going to entertain him that night. Deborah grew up in a small town in South Carolina, where hopes of greatness are only as reachable as the stars. Her mother was a single parent, a tireless caretaker who worked a night shift as a nurse to ensure that Deborah and her siblings would have food on the table. Even though they were not rich, there was always music around the house. The old vinyl records of her mother and an out-of-tune piano that a neighbor had given her spread Debbie's love for melody into melodic harmonies throughout her life. The old piano became a window to escape. While other kids of her age played outside, Deborah would sit for hours practicing how to play. She first imitated the songs playing on the radio, then went on to classical pieces which she found in second-hand music books. This talent was not left unnoticed. She started performing in the church, at school recitals, and at community functions. Still, this recognition could not hide the financial hurdles looming over her dreams. Until she was 18, the reality was finally clear. A professional career in music could wait. Scholarships did not come, and family responsibilities became most important. She packed up her ambitions about the concert and replaced them with earning her liveliness. Still, she could not let go of everything. The piano was a passion. It was her identity. When she had moved to Raleigh a few years ago, Deborah had taken the job at La Fontaine not only for the pay, but for the grand piano tucked into the corner of the restaurant. She rarely found time to play it, but knowing it was there gave her a comforting sense. The music hadn't left her. It had merely waited. That night, as Leonard and his entourage took their seats, Deborah moved to their table, balancing a tray with practiced grace. Leonard ordered a top-shelf scotch and cracked a joke loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. Deborah offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady, despite the peculiar energy radiating from him. "Deborah," her Leonard said, looking at her name tag. Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents. It caught her off guard, but she nodded politely, stepping away to place their orders. She didn't catch the knowing grin he shared with his companions, or the way his eyes followed her every movement. But Leonard wasn't just observing. He was planning, and Deborah would shortly find herself right at the center of a show she never wanted to give. The night wore on like any. A hum of laughter and clinking silverware filled the room. Deborah kept up her steady pace, purposefully keeping Leonard out of her line of vision as she moved along table to table. She had been around her fair share of condescending patrons, but there was something about him, socking her in the gut. Not just arrogant, but purposeful. Being around him, to her, was being under the axe, an unexplainably dreadful presence. By the time appetizers arrived, Leonard was into his act, and not precisely in the form Deborah might have predicted. Holding court at his table, loud, boisterous stories of his success, sprinkled with asides about what lack of drive got one. His entourage laughed on cue, and other diners glanced over, annoyed. As Deborah tried hard to focus on her job, returning with a bottle of wine to his table, Leonard caught her off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he said amidst all the noise, "what do you do when you are not carrying plates? Surely a girl so young must have a dream or so." His words had stopped at poor, but Deborah hesitated a moment before she gave a response, choosing her words carefully. "I sometimes play piano," she said softly, trying to pass it off as briefly as possible. Leonard's eyes lit up, and a sly smile curled across his face. "A pianist? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Deborah froze. It felt like the room had quieted, everything waiting for her response to Leonard's challenge. "Oh, I couldn't," she quickly said, forcing a nervous laugh into her voice. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard would not let that be. "Nonsense," he declared boisterously. "There it is, a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got." Surely, a future star isn't afraid of a little audience. His friends exploded with laughter then, really enjoying the spectacle. Other diners turned their heads, intrigued by the drama unfolding. Deborah's chest constricted. She could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment waiting to be said. She wanted to say no, to turn and walk away. But Leonard's challenge hung in the air, daring her to rise to it or crumple beneath the weight of it. "Really, I shouldn't," Deborah stammered, looking for backup. But even her colleague seemed loath to get involved. Leonard leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch with a knowing smirk. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words cut like a slap. Deborah's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't one to seek out confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, an amusing joke, a nobody, cut deeper than she had expected. The words of her mother came flooding into her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." There was a moment of silence between them. Deborah looked to the piano, then back at Leonard, who dared her to take the bait with his smug expression. And, despite her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." The room was electric with anticipation as Deborah approached the piano, her every step freighted with fear and defiance. The dining room seemed to hold its collective breath as Deborah approached the gleaming grand piano centered in the room. The soft glow of the chandelier above the table shone down on her like a spotlight, separating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers were shaking as she slid onto the bench, the slick keys gleaming like a challenge that was to be met right behind her. Leonard leaned back in his chair, the picture of smug satisfaction, as though he'd already won whatever game it was that he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a second, steadying her breath. Her heart was pounding so loud that she could hardly think this wasn't the church recitals or the cozy community gathering she'd once known. This was different. This was hostile, but there was no going back now. She laid hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface beneath her fingertips. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost fragile. A few diners stirred in their seats, and a solitary cough sounded in the room's rear. Deborah took no notice, her focus sharpening as she leaned into the music. She reached for a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair du Lin by Debussy. The melody spilled into the room, weaving through the air like a thread delicate, unyielding. As her confidence grew, the music swelled, her hands moving with a grace that belied the chaos inside her, the notes spilling out like a confession. Every chord seemed to carry a part of her story, the sacrifices her mother had made, the nights she'd spent practicing in that small room, the weight of dreams abandoned but never wholly surrendered. They all fell silent now, the sudden quiet a foil to the ruckus with which they'd entered. The whispering and murmurs even Leonard had generated had ceased now. Deborah had no need of glancing sideways at him in order to intuit the change. She could smell it, she felt it, wafting throughout the room in waves. But maybe humility, then the music dagger, and let herself go loose. For one instant, longer than any which had passed probably since the spring, she'd been neither a waitress nor one of those unfulfilled dreams. She simply was. Simply an artist, with fingers dancing at the keys now to draw feelings raw and graphic enough to seem shearing the space about her up like smoke, the air burning away. Deborah's hands rose, still and suspended, awaiting some word. Any word, but the room wasn't speaking then. It would not for almost a full 2 minutes. The sound thundered, echoing off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah hadn't expected. Some diners stood up, clapping hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. Her workmates, who had watched from the sidelines, joined in, faces aglow with pride. Leonard remained in his seat. His smirk gone, it was concealed by an expression Deborah couldn't place. Part shock, part unease. Leonard raised his hands and clapped. Slow, a hollow sound against the cheers around him. But even his vacant applause couldn't deflect from what Deborah had just done. She had her voice, and nothing would ever take that away from her again, not in the same way condescension couldn't. The applause, turning to murmurs, the room exhaled. Slowly, Deborah stood up, her knees still trembling, her back straight. She glanced around, and for the first time tonight, she really saw these people around her, watching, not as onlookers, but as witnesses. Their faces wore something new, admiration, respect, and even a tint of awe. Not looking at Leonard, she gave a slight, polite inclination of her head to the diners who had clapped the loudest, a slight curving of her lips. It wasn't pride that filled her. It was relief. She hadn't let her fear silence her. Then, as if magnetized, her gaze turned to Leonard. He remained seated, his hands clasped across in front of him on the table. His confident smirk, so brazen mere seconds ago, had vanished. Instead, his face was a forced mask of neutrality, as if he couldn't decide what course to take. Admit his mistake, or continue in his arrogance. Well, Leonard finally said louder than he needed to be, shattering the fragile silence that had fallen over the room. That was unexpected. He tittered, which wasn't as boastful. I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places. The comment fell flat. His friends glanced around at each other, obviously uncertain whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah tilted her head, then looked at him. An olive branch of words, spoken in a manner that seemed hollow because he did not own the space. "Thank you," Deborah said, in a steady, careful tone. There was no warmth in her tone. Neither was she sounding hostile. Without meaning to, she refused to take his bait and step with him back into smallness. Her performance did more talking than any response might have done. Leonard cleared his throat, seemingly very uneasy, pushed by the weight of everybody's eyes upon him. He gestured to the waiter for another drink, another very poor attempt at composure. "You've got quite a gift," he continued to say, almost in a begrudging manner. Deborah inclined her head once, her eyes never leaving the table. "Everyone has a gift," she said, and the weight of deliberation on every word hung there. "It's a question of how you choose to use it." The room started to hold its collective breath again, where the subtle sting in her response stirred the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard shifted in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each second passing. The diners started to refocus on their meals again, but the energy within the room had completely shifted. Whereas before there was a quiet buzz of privilege and pretense, there was something deeper now. Shared understanding, perhaps respect, for the waitress who had sent a reminder to all of the powers of authenticity. However, Leonard wasn't just humiliated. He was exposed, and no amount of charm could shield him from reality. Everybody in the room now saw Deborah step away from the piano, the weight of the moment setting in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish, but something about her posture had changed. Her head held a little higher, her movements more deliberate. Leonard's table had quieted. His entourage, who had so joyously and freely overheard her before, now studiously avoided making eye contact. Even their laughter seemed muffled now, the place where all that boastful bravado used to be strangely absent, replaced by a kind of awkward silence. The night kept moving on, though, and Deborah felt lightened. She felt as if she took each step through the dining room more meaningfully, her self-confidence flourishing in ways she hadn't even guessed. And as she refilled glasses and cleared plates, the patrons caught her notice, offering kind words. "You are incredible," a soft-spoken older woman whispered as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I have never heard anything so moving. Keep going. You've got something special," another man said. "Don't let anybody ever tell you any different." Deborah thanked them, stilled quiet humility rising inside her, feeling her heart grow with gratitude. These were more than compliments. They were validations of everything she worked for, of everything she had ever dreamed of being. Leonard wasn't being so chivalrous. As Deborah approached his table to hand him the check, he looked up at her with a look that oscillated between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You have made your point," he said, his tone clipped. There was no need to rub it in. Deborah stopped and met his eyes squarely. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied calmly but firm. "I just wanted to play." Leonard didn't have any response. He shifted his drink about in his glass. his commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The dynamic of power had been turned completely upside down, and everyone at the table knew it. As Leonard signed the check, one of his friends, a younger man with a softer countenance, looked over at Deborah and said, "You were amazing, truly." She hadn't been prepared for the sincerity in his voice, and for a moment she saw a glimmer of humanity in a group she'd written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night closed with Leonard and his group leaving stealthily, their characteristic grand exit now a flee-for-your-life retreat. Deborah watched them go, neither at triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was on the next step. The tips that night were uncommonly good, enough to pay the rent and leave a little bit over for piano lessons she had been deferring. As she locked up and walked home, the cool air filling her lungs, for the first time in years, Deborah felt something surety. She wasn't just a waitress and not just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, not jeering words, not financial struggle, not fear could take that from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the conflict of that night. Her thoughts were on the future, when finally her dreams seemed closer. Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. It wasn't as clear or full as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just a win. It was some sort of epiphany that her talent wasn't something that she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. Events at the restaurant became something of a local story in the days that followed, patrons sharing a tale of her performance, and word began to trickle out. A few days later, Deborah took a call from a man who had been dining in the restaurant that night, and happened to be a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering her fame or fortune, but an opportunity to record a demo, a step toward some dream she had only just begun to allow herself. Deborah agreed, not because she thought it might change everything overnight, but because this door was opening, and she wasn't afraid to walk through it. She had let those two companions, fear and doubt, hush lies into her ears for so many years that she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. Now she saw the truth. It was resilience and authenticity that were her biggest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just some public, humiliating incident turned into a victory. It was but one thing and reminder: integrity, an end in itself, is power. Leonard, with all his money and braggadocio, has absolutely nothing that can take anything away from her. He represents every voice of doubt she'd ever encountered, and she silenced him with nothing more than the purity of her craft. To anyone who will watch her story, Deborah would send an unmistakable message: never let another person define your worth. The world is full of Leonard Grayson's people, projecting their insecurities onto other people to make themselves feel powerful. But true power is staying rooted in who you are and letting your passion speak louder than the ridicule. She smiled as she closed the lid of the piano and laid her hands on the worn wood. She had just started. But for the first time in her life, it was really happening. And you? What's the dream that has held you back because of either fear or uncertainty? Well, don't wait for a Leonard to come along and test you. Take your step today. If Deborah's story has inspired you, then subscribe to hear more stories of resiliency and triumph. Yours may be the next.